And we're off. Hopefully, let's go see if I can find this video so I can follow along with myself and make sure I can read the messages. There we go. Oh, there we go. There I am. So welcome back to anybody who's there. I'm going to give you all a few minutes to show up, since right now I'm the only person looking at my own video, and that's kind of boring. Nope, someone's watching. Hello. An error occurred. What? What just happened? I'm still recording. There we go. Okay, now we're there. So I have one person. Can give people a little bit. Give people a little bit to watch. A little bit of time to join in. So what we're going to be talking about in this Q&A, the whole point of this is to sort of go over file input and output, talk about how files work, just give you an idea of what's going on. If you have questions, please feel free to ask in the chat. I'm going to try to, as much as possible, monitor what's going on. Okay, good. So I was just trying to make sure I was up to date. So what I have so far is just an example. I needed a data set. I wanted a plain. We're going to start by talking about how we do this with plain text files. I wanted some plain text file. I wanted something a little bit interesting or whatever. So there's a project called Project Gutenberg, which happens to work for large files, particularly large out of copyright files. So the version I got, the file I got was the Jane Austen Pride and Prejudice special. So one thing that you can do to add files to your Replit is, I happen to download this file. If you see, as I get mouse over the files area, it's giving me this drop files and folders here just to upload them. So I can actually just upload, assuming it pays attention, I can just upload and now my computer's decided it hates me. There we go. So when I drag and drop it, I can just upload the file that way. And so if you see, I can click on this link and I get, eventually, all of the text of Pride and Prejudice. So another thing I can do is, what I have here is some code. And suppose that I didn't want to read all of Pride and Prejudice, because God knows I don't actually want to read all of Pride and Prejudice. But I just want to read chapter 1. I just want the results for chapter 1 of this book. So what I have right now is a little bit of code that I wrote ahead of time just to start us off, to look at how could we just print out the contents of chapter 1. So the first thing I do is I open the file. Remember, if we want to work with a text file or any file, we use the with as construct. So with, open, and then the name of the file. Now, I could have this whole string in there, or I could have a variable that is representing, standing in for the string. Either way is fine. And then I say as f, that's my file variable is f. And then I say, I'm going to create this variable because we don't always want to print. We only want to print when we're in chapter 1. So we need to know when that is. So printing is assigned false. And then to go through each line of this text file, what I need to do is say for line in f. And then now when we read in a whole line, not only do we read in the line, but we also read in that new line, that thing to go to the next line at the end of it, which we usually don't want. So we can use this rstrip command here to remove that ending new line. So this is a typical thing when we're processing a file line by line, to have something like line is assigned line.rstrip and then that. So just removes it from there. So given that, if I wanted to, I could just have it print each line, get rid of this, And if I do that, you can see it's going to print out all of Pride and Prejudice, and this is going to take a while. So, okay, I don't care. Stop. That was a mistake. Okay. So while it's doing that, that's obviously not what we want to do. Instead, what we want to do is just go through from chapter 1. So what we'll do is we'll say when we find the line that says chapter 1, that's how the differences are made, I happen to know. So we can do that. So when it says line is assigned chapter 1, we can set printing to true. So we'll start printing when we see that chapter 1. And the next chapter would be chapter 2. So elif, line is assigned chapter 2. Printing is going to be assigned false. And so now if we run it, rather than having that huge amount of text, what we're going to get is just the text from chapter 1. Right? So we could do, this is just here. Again, this if printing is just here to limit that, right? And one thing you'll notice, I just have if printing, just the variable. I could, if I wanted to, say if printing is equivalent to true. But the reason we usually do these tests for equivalency is to create a Boolean value. Of course, printing, that variable, when it's evaluated, already has a Boolean value. I don't need to do a comparison for that. So generally speaking, most programmers would not do that. So given this, suppose that in addition to printing out everything in chapter 1, after we're done with that, we want to print out all of the quotations in this book, all of the lines, or at least all the lines that begin with a quotation mark. This is, not too difficult. Remember that every string can be thought of as a kind of list. We can actually get each individual character. So if I want to do that, right, so we'll loop through it again. So I'm actually going to do something real quick. I'm going to add a printout at the end of the loop, just so we know where one thing ends, starts, next thing ends. And then what I could do is I could say for, we'll go through the line. And we'll say if that first character is equivalent to the quotation mark, and if I remember correctly, this book uses not the standard quotation mark, but the really fancy one that's like in Word or something like that. So let me copy and paste that in. So if that first character is a quotation mark, then I want to print the line. So before I do this, I just realized one thing I forgot to do, and I need to, is use that R strip, right? I need to remove get this indented properly. Remove that trailing new line just so it looks pretty when I print it out. And so now we're ready to run it. So I'm going to run this. And when I run this, it doesn't work, right? You can see it printed out all of chapter 1, printed out my little stars here as a divider, and then it stopped. Any of you watching have any idea why this didn't work? What error it was dealing with? Seconds more. Any ideas whatsoever? Okay, well, we didn't ask it to stop printing at the end quotation. Well, we did say, like right here, if we said if it's got the quotation mark as that first thing. So that's another good question. Is it because the indentation of the for loop? Nope, the for loop is inside of our with as statement. We don't need to tell it to stop printing at the end of the quotation because we just are looking for the first line of the quotation. Those are both really good ideas. Unfortunately, neither one of them is correct. The problem here is in how you're thinking about this variable, this file object variable works. When we have a file object variable, right, we use it to go through our file once. We're counting on it to only go through the file once, right? That's why we, in this first loop, we end when we stop going through, right? When that first time I printed out everything, it went through the entire Pride and Prejudice and printed it all out. It stops as soon as we hit the end of file. Now, when I'm using it in a for loop again, it would be really nice if Python realized, oh, this is a new for loop. I probably should reset that file object to the very beginning and we can redo this all the time. But that's not how it works. When we create a file object in a with as statement, it is a single use item. As soon as we hit that end of file, we're done. We cannot use it again. So this code here is fine. The problem is that we can't use that variable f again without reopening the file, without creating a new variable f, as it were. So if I wanted to get this to work, if I create a new with as, so now I have a second with as statement, one that will print out all the data for chapter 1 and some stars. And now what we're going to have here is, just for comfort, I'm going to give it a different name. We'll have f2. We'll reopen the variable. We'll create a new file object, and I run it. And now it gives me an error. So the question was, so basically you'll have to open every time you exit a for loop. If you want to reuse that file, yes, that is exactly what I'm saying. That is exactly the point. The reason for this error is because there are some blank lines on it. So for this to work, one of the things I need to do is make sure I don't use this when the line is blank. So one way I can do that is I can say if len of line is greater than 0 and line at index 0 is equivalent to that new open paren or open quote, right? And the power of this is that, remember that an and, it first evaluates what's on the left-hand side. And when that's false, so if the length of the line is 0, it doesn't even bother with the right-hand side. So doing this gets me out of that error. And now you can see I'm going to get, good Lord, did she like quotes? I get every line that begins with a quotation mark in Pride and Prejudice also. Every time we want to use a file from the start, we have to go through and create a new with as. We have to open that file again. Make sense? Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. If not, ask now. Not sure how long the delay is. So the next issue that occurs to me that I don't like is this is a lot of code not in a function and everything. And I don't usually do that. I usually have almost no code outside of any function. I like to use functions. They're helpful. So suppose I wanted a function print chapter 1. So this function, right, I just wanted to print chapter 1. Now, a lot of times we'll pass in a file name because it can be easier for doing processing the entire file or whatever, but we don't have to. Suppose I want to pass in a file object. So it's going to get a file object in, so it'll have one parameter. Then what I can do is, just take all this code, copy and paste it into here, get my indentation to work out. In. And then in my with as, call print So the question then is this going to work? And this looks, I realize, kind of weird, right? We have this with as, and we're calling a function. We've done function calls before. I mean, print is a function call. We're passing that file object, and it's just a regular file object, as a argument, but just a variable that we are using. That isn't any different. But now what does look kind of weird is in this print chapter 1, we're reading from a file and we're handling it, but there's no with as statement there. And the thing is, let's try to run it, see what happens. So we can see there's all those quotes. She really does like her quotes. But if I scroll up high enough, wow, she really does like too many quotes. Let's just do this. For a moment, I'm going to get rid of this just so you can see. Note that we print all of chapter 1. This works perfectly well. The reason why this works perfectly well, but you may not think that it should or whatever, is for 2 reasons. One, yet again, your eyes are kind of lying to you, right? And the reason is, when you're looking at this code right now, you're looking at this code and you're thinking, well, I know what this line does, and I know what this line does, and they seem to be weirdly placed or whatever. But remember that Python is a computer, right? We're running it on a computer, and something with an IQ of 0, provably an IQ of 0. And so we have to think about how this code is actually going to be executed. And when we want to execute this code, right, what are we going to do? Well, we have a function. We'll skip over that. We don't execute that until there's a function call. So we then hit this, we assign VA. We then do with open. We open up that file. And now inside the body of that with as, in that code suite, we have that open file and we call the function. So while the function code is here, in this case, it's going to be executed inside the function. And so it's going to work perfectly well. Now, on the other hand, if what I had done is, I need a statement here, so we'll just print out hi. And I need a statement there. I tried to call print function 1 outside of the with as. So when we're no longer in the with as, now when I run this code, it prints out hi perfectly well, but it complains about us trying to do IO because now this statement, this function call, isn't in the with as code suite. The question is not where is the code written, right? What do your eyes see? The question, and what Python really does, is it thinks about where is the code executed. And here, right now, the way the code is written, the code is going to be executed outside of that with as block. So it's going to give me an error. When I put the function call inside the block, now it gets executed inside that block, and it's legal. Everybody okay with this so far? Okay. If you still, sorry, I don't know how long the lag is for each person. If you have questions, feel free, again, to ask it in the chat. I have no problem coming back to that. So that sort of covers the basics of reading a text file. Reading a text file is actually pretty simple. One last thing I just want to point out. Right now, the name of this file is prideandprejudice.txt. Another thing that we could do, though, is we could rename this file prideandprejudice.png, right, which is an image file. And if I do that, I'll rename the file here and run this program. It works perfectly well. One thing to remember is that the file name of a file isn't meaningful to the computer. It doesn't know the difference between .txt, .csv, .png, anything else. It just tells it how to interpret the zeros and ones, the bytes, the data inside that file. If we're using the text file reader, then it's going to treat it like a text file. If we use the CSV file reader, we'll get to that in a little bit, then it'll treat it as a CSV file. Whatever you tell the computer to use it as, that's what it's going to use it as. The name itself doesn't actually matter. It doesn't change anything. So suppose that in addition to printing out chapter 1, what I want to do is I'm going to bring back the code. And what we had before, add my with as, with OpenVA. Suppose, we'll just go with this. We wanted to not print out chapter 1, but we wanted to save it to a file. So in this case, what we're going to need to use is another file. We need to output it to 1. So we'll need another with as statement. And I'm just going to use the file name directly here because I don't think that we need to do much more than that. And I'll just name it output.txt because that's really what we're doing it for. And then I'm actually going to change these names. One of the things I can't deal with, if I have a file, I have no problem naming the variable f, but I would usually use like f in and f out just so I can very quickly from the variable name understand what's going on. And I want this file to be for writing, so I'm going to add the w. That means erase the contents of output.txt rather than doing anything else. And now what I can do is I'm going to keep my printing variable. I got to indent all this stuff. But now, rather than printing it out, I want to write it to the file. In order to write it to the file, for a normal text file, what I have to do is use the write function. And so now if I run the code, having added this write function, if I updated the variable correctly and run it, you can see that it added this output.txt into the files. It created that file, and when we look at it, it did not work properly because I have f out outside of my for loop. In case you're curious about the difference between, when I've said the difference between a novice programmer and an experienced programmer is, frankly, that the experienced programmers made these errors, same errors that you make all the time. We're just faster at finding them and fixing them. That's the case. So I only want to do if printing. So there we will only output chapter 1, run it again. And now if I look at my output, you can see, well, it's almost like all of chapter 1 is there. But if you look at the output, note that there are no line breaks. There's no new lines in there. And the reason why is, but when we print it out, we do have them. The print statement automatically adds a new line at the end of whatever you print out. The write statement does not. So if we want to write things out and have it be readable, we have to add that new line on our own. So now if I run it, you can see that that output is the same. And when we look in here, now it looks the way that Jane Austen would have wanted us to. But this actually brings up an interesting question. Suppose that rather than, we don't really care. I mean, I don't know if any of you have ever read Jane Austen or Pride and Prejudice. Needless to say, I have not. I think I had to read a Jane Austen book when I was in high school, and I hated it. So I don't really care about this. I'm just curious how many characters she uses. What is the length of each line? So rather than printing out each line in chapter 1, let's just print out its length. This seems like a much easier thing to do. And so now we can run it. And when we run it, what do we get? What we get is an error. And the reason we get an error is that that write function requires a string, a str, as its argument. So if we wanted to write the length of each line, we cannot pass in len_line. That's an int, that's a number. We have to call that str function to make it into a string. And then because I want the results to be readable, I will add a new line. And now when I run the code, and I remember to have the right number of closed parentheses, now when I have the code and I remember to have the correct number of closed parentheses, sorry, it's been a long day for me, probably for you all too. Now you can see it outputs totally properly here. And when I look at output.txt, we have the length of each one of those lines. So that's the basics of reading and writing text files, but they're kind of boring and hard to work with because all they can do is contain strings. That's it. That's all they do. A lot of times, if we want to work with data, we're going to use a CSV file. And so in order to do that, I'm actually going to get rid of this code, unless there are any questions. Don't see any. So we can think about how we're going to, how we'd be able to read and write from a CSV file. So in order to do that, I'm going to need a CSV file. And again, I'm just going to use that drag and drop trick. I'm going to drop over. Apparently have to let go of it really quickly, or just have more mouse skills than I have. There we go. So I'm going to use this CSV file. It's heating.csv, right? This is just the CSV file from the CSV reading lecture. It's not a particularly interesting file, right? You can see it's I happen to know it's a CSV, right? A CSV file is just a text file that we're going to use in sort of a table form. So it's going to be a table. We're going to read it in as a table, right? And the difference between the columns is a comma. It's a little bit more tricky than that because we could have a comma as data, but basically it's just a comma, right? So we have 3 columns: month, budget, and actual. So let's suppose that we want to read this file in. So we'll need our with as. I'm going to write a function for this because that's how I do it. And I'm going to take in a CSV reader object because I know that's how you read in a CSV file, so that makes sense to me. And so with that, we still get to use a for loop. And for the first part of it, let's just print the line and let's just see what it looks like, what we're going to get. So now in my main program, I'm going to use my with open. I called it heating.csv. Again, I have this thing about names. So in order to have a CSV reader object, I need to create it. I don't get it automatically. So what I can do is have a variable, and the way we get this object is csv.reader, and then we give it the file. And now what I could do is call my read budget function. And just as before, I realized that the read budget function itself doesn't have a with open statement, that there isn't a CSV reader that's being done in there, but right, I have the reader object. When that gets executed, this reader object is going to exist, and so we'd be okay. But if you look, I've got this red underline here for CSV reader and saying undefined name CSV. Remember, whenever you have in Python this, sort of these functions, something dot something, that means we're using a different module. We need to have an import. So for this all to work, and this is one of the benefits of using a program like a Replit, it tells us when we're about to make a mistake. So I have to have that import CSV. And so as soon as I do that, note that that error goes away. And so now we're ready to go. So let me clear that off just so we can see it, make sure we understand what we're seeing. I'm going to run this program. And we can see how that line gets read in. If you look, everything here starts with a bracket and ends with a bracket. When the CSV library reads in a CSV file, we use that CSV reader, we're going to get back a list. Because, right, it's just a big table. So as we go through this, we're going to get a list for each one of those rows, right? The first row is month, budget, and actual, and that's what we get in our list. The next row is January 200 and 190, and you'll note we get January, and that part's fine. We do get 200, but note that 200 is in quotation marks. We have 190, but note that 190 is in quotation marks. The reason why they're all in quotation marks is they're all considered strings, right? This is a text file. The CSV is a type of text file. Everything in it is a string. It doesn't have a number. Yes, all of you and me, we can tell that 200 should be a number because we know how to interpret this. We know what we're really trying to do here, right? This is the budgeted amount for heating in January. 200, it makes sense that that's a number. The computer can't know any of that. From its perspective, this is just a structured text file, and so therefore it's text. But that's okay, because we can handle this, right? So we know, let's actually return, and this is actually from the lecture, we'll create an accumulator that's going to be a dictionary, and what we'll do is we'll get the month, and that is a string, so we don't need to do anything there. And then we'll get the budgeted amount. And now we want the budgeted amount to be a number. It should be a number. When we're dealing with CSV files, if we want something to be a number, we have to call the function either int or float, depending on what type of number we want. So here I'm going to call int and pass in line 1. So I'll convert that first column, the budgeted amount, to a number. And then I want to do the same thing for actual. And then I'm going to I'm going to map it. And what I want to do is I'll add this to our dictionary. I'll use the month as the key. And its value will be whatever the budget minus actual was. How much did we spend? And then at the end of the function, after the loop is done, I'll return our accumulator. Standard accumulator pattern. So now what I'll do is I'll get the result in our main program and print it out. This again, hopefully fairly straightforward. Don't see any questions. So see what happens if we run it. And when we run it, it gives us an error. And the reason it gives us an error, you can see here, invalid literal for int. So where we're calling one of these int functions, it's actually line 13. It tells us that. So, or line 6, excuse me, called from line there. So this line right here, where we're trying to get an int for our budget, it's giving us an error. And the reason why is it's saying, you gave me the string budget. And that can't be turned into an int, right? Yeah, you and I, again, we have an IQ over 0. We know that that first line is just has the headers for each column and isn't really part of our data. But the computer can't know it, and we didn't tell it to skip over that. So if we want to skip over that, what we can do is use a function. I'm actually going to make I'll just do it in here. What I can do is use that function next, pass in our reader, right? And what this does is it reads in that one line from our CSV file, that first row, assigns results to headers, so we can print out headers just to see that. And remember, just like before, we said each time we exit a for loop, we'd have to open up a new reader or CSV reader if we wanted to. As soon as we advance past a row using a file reader, we've permanently advanced past that row. We can never rewind. So what this is going to do is this will read in the header, mainly in our main body, but since we're using the same CSV reader, now our budget is going to be perfectly okay, right? For each month, we have how much of the difference was between the budgeted amount for heat and the actual amount for heat. And you can see that first printout here is the header for each of the rows, month, budget, and actual. So that gets us part of the way. But now let's suppose that we want to output this result. We want to output what the result is. So we could do it in the same with as statement, but we're going to have that month's dictionary, so there's no reason to. So I'm going to create another with as. And I'm going to open a CSV file. I want to output to a CSV file. And in order to write to a CSV file, I need to make this. I need a CSV writer object. The way I do that is I create a CSV. I call csv.writer, and I give it the file object we want to write to. And now I can use that CSV writer to write out the result. So what I want to do is I want to write out the results. I want to write out each month, the name of the month, and then the budget, the difference between the budgeted and actual amounts as a row. So let's create a for loop. That's how we go through things. So for month in months.keys, right? So that's how we can go through. Now month will be each key in turn. So what we can do, I remember from the slides, the name of the function is write row. That writer, month. And so now I can try to write it and run this program. And when I do, it's saying on line 23, that's this line right here, right? Line 23, iterable expected, not int. Might seem like a weird issue. But then what you can remember is if you go back and look, we had talked about however many weeks ago, that when we call write row, we're supposed to provide a list. So I can turn that number into a list, right? If I just put it inside of brackets, now it's not the value, whatever that value is, the number 10, whatever, but it's the list with just one thing in it, 10. So this should work. So now let's try running it. And it worked perfectly well. Good. So let's look at what that budget.csv file has as its result. This is not exactly what I was expecting. Maybe it wasn't what you were expecting. Right, so there are a couple different issues here. One is I said I wanted each month to be a single row. And if you look, I've got the name of the month and then the budgeted amount. The name of the month, the amount, and the name of the month, the amount, right? I didn't get the data I wanted. And this I can explain pretty easily, right? Every time we call write row, the program, Python, is going to write out a whole row. So if I wanted to write this all down as one row, I can only call write row once. A bigger issue, though, is if you look, it's really kind of weird. Rather than having the string January, it's got J, and then A, then N, right? Separated by commas. The reason it's doing this is because we need to provide a list. And if you remember, a string is kind of like a list. In particular, what it is it's a almost like a list. And so when write row gets there, it says, oh, well, this is kind of like a list. I guess you want me to output it like a list. So let me just print it out with commas between each of its entries, between each of the characters there. So if you call write row with a string, it's legal. You're just not going to get what you want, right? Instead, look, why don't we do this? Row equals, and we want the row to be a list because we need that. And the first column in that list should be the key. And the second column should be that result. Now we can call write row with that. And if we look, now you can see we get the correct result. The first column is the month, January, February, March, April, May. The second column is that budgeted amount. All this makes sense to everybody. I mean, this is stuff we really talked about. Some of it was in the video from, I guess, 2 weeks ago now, before break, before everything went sideways in the world, about how to write to CSVs, also how to read from CSVs, read from files. Any questions you all have? Okay, if nobody has any more questions, this is basically what I wanted to get through for today. So then why don't we call it a day? Thank you all very much. Hopefully this was helpful. In the writer function, how did I actually open the data from heating CSV? In the writer function, I didn't open the data from CSV, right? I was using that month's dictionary that I had saved already. So I was just using data that we had already read in. So just like every other program, we can continue to use variables. That was how that worked. And then I just looped through it. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay, good. That answered your question. In that case, thank you all. Will I be continuing these sessions? Yeah, the plan is that I'm going to have a QA session every lecture. Wow, my computer just reset itself for some reason. The plan is I had one of these QA lectures on Monday about the material in Monday's lecture. On Friday, we'll have a QA session, again like this, about the material on Friday. If you ever miss one of these, if you look, they all get saved, something YouTube does automatically, so you can go back and look at it. If you can't make one of these QA sessions, but you really have a question, if you let me know ahead of time, either posting something in Piazza, emailing me just saying, hey, during today's Q&A, can you address this? I'll do my best to do that, make sure I address it. With that, I thank you all very much. Stay safe, stay healthy, keep up with the work. Remember that there are the lecture videos for today. Today's not much of a lecture video, admittedly, in Panopto. Remember, there is a attendance question at the end of one of the videos every lecture, and most lectures will have a top hat. Because we were doing mostly review today, there isn't a top hat. But with that, thank you all, and I will talk to you, whatever, later. Bye.